Teacher Talking Sports, what it does, what do, how we live. And let's continue the NFL Mount Rushmore series I've been doing, where I name who I believe are the four best players in each decade NFL history. Started with the 2010s. I am now on the 1970s. So let's get into the four I chose. Later in the video, we'll go over why, what they did during the decade to get chosen. So, in alphabetical order by last name, we have Mean Joe Green, Jack Ham, Alan Page, and Roger Staubach. I mean, I could have made this an all Steelers Mount Rushmore, and it would have been acceptable. But some honorable mentions. Now, maybe the toughest omission. Well, one was Terry Bradshaw. I thought long and hard about him. But another one, O.J. Simpson. Now, I did not include him because of off the field stuff. I strictly look at how the player did on the field. For OJ, it was just that half the decade he was awesome. The other half, not as much. So, I went with guys who dominated the decade throughout. But definitely a tough omission, as was Bradshaw. But others include Jack Lambert, Walter Payton, who didn't play the whole decade, Fran Tarkington, Franco Harris, Art Shell, Larry Little, Gene Upshaw, Mel Blount, Ken Houston, and Paul Krause. A lot of guys who put up a lot of interceptions in the secondary in the 70s. But let's get into the four I chose, starting with Mean Joe Green. His career actually began in 1969, but he played the whole 1970s decade with the Steelers over those 10 seasons. Now, sacks weren't an official stat, but the defensive tackle, according to Pro Football Reference, recorded 60 sacks over that time. Not many stats during those days, but was arguably one of the best is one of the best defensive tackles of all time. He was named Defensive Player of the Year in both 1972 and 1974. Also had Defensive Player of the Year finishes of 3rd, 5th, and 8th. Was Defensive Rookie of the Year. Well, that was 1969, never mind. But he made the Pro Bowl every year in the decade. Was a 4-time first-team All-Pro. Numerous seasons where he did not miss a game. Started out in 14-game seasons for them, but was a mainstay in the Steelers lineup. One of the most feared defensive players really in NFL history, and of course a part of that famed Steel Curtain defense. Part of 4 championship teams in the decade during the 1974, 1975, 1978, and 1979 seasons. Was kind of a pop culture figure in that time. Not many defensive tackles are that. Joe Green was. He is the first member of my 1970s Mount Rushmore. Next, another Steelers player. That is Jack Ham. Ham did not play in 1970 as he was the second round, 34th overall pick in the 1971 NFL draft, but did play 9 seasons. The linebacker in that time recorded 28 interceptions, 1 for a touchdown, 14 fumble recoveries, 1 for a touchdown, 21 and a half unofficial sacks. But yes, one of the best linebackers of the era by easily. 6 straight first-team All-Pros from 1974 to 1979. Also had Defensive Player of the Year finishes of 2nd in 1978 and 4th in 1979. A Pro Bowler each of the last 7 seasons of the decade. In 8 of the 9 seasons that he played in the decade, he had at least 2 interceptions, including 1972 when he had 7, 1 with 5, 1 with 4. So a guy who definitely was a ball hawk as well as a stellar linebacker. Another member of the famed Steel Curtain defense, first ballot Hall of Famer in 1988. He was also a part of 4 Super Bowl winning teams from the Pittsburgh Steelers. 15 playoff games in the decade, picked off 5 passes in that time. Jack Ham, I think when I did my Mount Rushmore for linebackers, actually Jack Lambert over him. Jack Ham might have been my toughest omission, but Lambert didn't start his career, I believe, until 1974. So for the 70s, I gave Jack Ham the advantage. Next, let's go with another defensive tackle. This is definitely the most defense-heavy Mount Rushmore I've done thus far, and that is Alan Page. Page began his career in 1967, but from 1970 to 1979, he actually played with the Vikings until 1978, then joined the Bears about midway through the season, played for the Bears in 1979. But during that time, Pro Football Reference credits him for 101 and a half sacks, mighty impressive from the defensive tackle position. One of the more feared defenders as well. Now, in the 80s video, I mentioned that Lawrence Taylor is one of two defensive players to win MVP in the history of the NFL. He was the second. The first was Alan Page, who won MVP in 1971. That year, he was also Defensive Player of the Year. He also had an MVP finish of third in 1970, twice finished fourth in Defensive Player of the Year voting, was a four-time first-team All-Pro, named to Pro Bowl each of the first 7 seasons in the decade. Again, sacks were not an official stat, but according to Pro Football Reference, he had 6 seasons with double-digit sacks. Approximate value, a measure that Pro Football Reference uses to show how good a player is. He twice led the league in that category, according again to Pro Football Reference. But part of 3 Super Bowl teams with the Vikings. Now, they did not win any of them, but were one of the better teams throughout much of the decade. Alan Page, dominant defensive tackle. He is the third member of my 1970s Mount Rushmore. And let's end with the one offensive player I included on here. That is the great Roger Staubach, Captain Comeback. Played the whole decade with the Dallas Cowboys. Now, couple seasons, 1970, 1972, he wasn't really a full-time starter. But in the decade, 113 starts, went 84 and 29. Of course, quarterback stats, rules definitely weren't as quarterback friendly. Not a passer friendly era compared to now, so numbers are down from today's quarterbacks. But Staubach completed 57.1% of his passes, 22,279 yards, 152 touchdowns, 107 interceptions, 83.6 rating. Staubach was named to the Pro Bowl 6 times in the decade, including the last 5 years in the decade. Finishes the runner-up for MVP in 1971. Also had 2 fourth-place finishes in MVP voting. Led the league in touchdown passes in 1973. One of 3 seasons he had more than 20. Led the league in passer rating 4 times, including an outstanding 104.8 in 1971, which was definitely mighty impressive for the era. Again, Captain Comeback, had 13 fourth-quarter comebacks and 21 game-winning drives in the decade. Staubach was a member of 2 Super Bowl winning teams during the 1973 and 1977 seasons. In the decade, he went 11-6 as a starter, 23 touchdown passes. Roger Staubach was Super Bowl MVP during that 1971 season. He is the 4th member of my 1970s Mount Rushmore. So let me know in the comments if you agree, disagree with the 4 guys I chose. Definitely not an easy one. Again, O.J. Simpson, Terry Bradshaw definitely got a lot of consideration from me. But stay tuned for tomorrow. I'll be doing the 1960s. Anyhow, don't forget to subscribe. Tell a friend, tell a friend, tell a friend to subscribe. Like the video, share the video, hit the bell for notifications. I'm out.